Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show where we take a whole stack of sources, could be ancient texts, modern research, philosophical debates, and we really dig into them.
Right, we sift through it all to pull out the key insights, the important stuff, so you can be genuinely well-informed on some pretty complex topics.
And today, we're wrestling with a really big one, a question that's shaped human history for, well, millennia. It gets right to the core of things. How do we as people relate to the natural world?
Yeah, is it something we just own? Something we're meant to, control? Or is it more like we're caretakers? Do we have some kind of responsibility?
Exactly. That's the fundamental question.
Yeah.
And it perfectly sets the stage for our deep dive today into environmental stewardship and property.
And these aren't just like abstract ideas for academics. They really dictate so much: what we eat, how our communities manage local parks or rivers, even huge global things like climate change.
Absolutely. Understanding this relationship is key to understanding our impact, our place on the planet.
So our mission today is to explore this through some really diverse sources. We've got the Old Testament, classical philosophy, medieval thinkers, modern ethics, even indigenous practices.
It's quite a mix. We're going to try and uncover the assumptions hiding beneath the surface, see how these ideas about land and nature have changed over time, and look at the challenges we face right now.
Yeah, get ready to maybe rethink some things you thought you knew. I think we'll all walk away with some pretty profound new perspectives by the end.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking this big term, environmental stewardship. It sounds maybe a bit formal, maybe something for, policy wonks. What does it actually mean?
Well, at its core, it's really about embracing this idea of resilience. Resilience in how we deal with a world that's constantly changing.
Resilience. Okay, what does that mean in this context? Not just being tough, I assume.
No, it's more dynamic than that. It's a system ability to recover after some kind of disturbance. Could be a flood, a fire, pollution, whatever.
Yeah.
And not just recover, but get back to its basic function, its structure, or maybe even adapt into a new healthy state.
Okay, so like a forest after a big wildfire. Stewardship isn't just about replanting trees right away.
Exactly. It's about understanding the whole system's capacity to regenerate itself, to bounce back, and to keep providing those vital services, clean air, water, habitat.
That makes sense. So it's not about keeping things frozen in time, but understanding the living, dynamic nature of these ecosystems.
Precisely. And the sources really stress this shift. Ecosystems aren't just like a pile of resources for us to grab, not just timber or fish.
Right.
They're complex, interconnected systems, providing a whole range of what the sources call function-dependent services.
Can you give us some more examples of those services? What does that actually look like?
Sure. Think about that forest again. It's not just wood, right? It cleans the air, takes in CO2, releases oxygen. Its roots stop soil from washing away. It acts like a giant filter for water going into streams. It helps regulate the local climate with shade and moisture. It provides habitat for pollinators we need for crops, biodiversity that might hold new medicines.
So these aren't just resources we take, they're ongoing life support functions that depend on the ecosystem being healthy.
Exactly. And this view also recognizes something else that's really important. The people managing these resources, the systems they use, they aren't outside observers looking in.
What are they then?
They're influential and informed participants within the natural systems. It's more like a partnership, a reciprocal thing, not just top-down control.
Interesting. So if that's the concept, who are the stewards? The sources mention 3 different roles, right? Like categories of people involved.
That's right. It helps break it down. Broadly, you've got the doers, the donors, and the practitioners.
Let's take those one by one. Doers. Sounds pretty straightforward.
It is, mostly. These are the people doing the hands-on work. Volunteering for an oil spill cleanup, maybe, or planting trees along a riverbank after a storm.
Getting their hands dirty.
Yeah, exactly. Doing the physical work that has an immediate impact on the ground.
Okay. Then the donors. That's more than just writing a check, isn't it?
It can be, yeah. Financial support is obviously huge: personal donations, fundraising drives, all that.
Sure.
But it also includes what the sources call gifts in kind. That could be donating equipment, maybe a drone for monitoring, like you said.
Or skills.
Definitely. Offering pro bono legal help for a conservation group, or doing their accounting. It's about providing the resources, financial or otherwise, to make the work happen.
Got it. And the third group, the practitioners. These are the pros.
Yeah, these are the folks whose day job is environmental stewardship. Think conservation biologists, sustainable urban planners, environmental engineers working on new tech, policy advocates.
Right, the people working within the system.
Exactly. They often act as advocates, working with government agencies, NGOs, research groups. Their work tends to be more strategic, long-term, looking at the bigger picture, often needs deep expertise.
So 3 different roles, but it sounds like they all share a common goal.
They do. Ultimately, it's all about promoting environmental literacy, helping everyone understand these issues, and encouraging more people to participate in conservation in whatever way they can.
It's about empowering people.
Right. And the places where stewardship applies are incredibly broad. It's not just wilderness conservation.
What else?
Well, the sources list things like energy conservation, renewable energy, obviously, but also pollution control, waste management, natural resource management.
Everyday stuff, too.
Yeah, encouraging public transport, recycling, sewage treatment, water purification, even things like urban metabolism, how energy and materials flow through cities, or road ecology, looking at the impact of roads on wildlife.
Wow. Okay. So it really touches almost everything.
It really does, and it connects deeply with other fields, too.
Like what?
Environmental social science, the human side of it, education, ethics, our moral duties, law, the rules we make, and environmental justice.
Justice. How does that fit in?
Well, ensuring that the burdens, like pollution, and the benefits, like clean parks, are shared fairly. Often, marginalized communities bear the brunt of environmental problems. Stewardship has to address that.
So it's this really broad, interconnected concept woven right into society.
Absolutely. It's not some niche issue.
Okay, so that gives us a good handle on stewardship itself.
Mm-hmm.
But to really grasp its ethics, its evolution, we need to go back, way back.
Yeah, this debate about land, ownership, responsibility, it's ancient. These aren't new questions.
Let's start with one of the most influential texts, the Old Testament. What's striking is how it frames that human-land relationship right from the start. It feels different from how we often talk about ownership now.
It really does. The absolute foundational idea, the non-negotiable starting point in the Old Testament, is that the earth belongs to God. Full stop.
Psalm 115, right?
Yeah.
The heavens are the Lord's heavens, but the earth he has given to the children of man.
Exactly. So humans are positioned not as owners, but as the text calls them alien tenants.
Tenants. That immediately sets up a different dynamic, not outright ownership.
Right. It implies conditional use, responsibility, not just possession. The ultimate ownership remains divine.
But then you have the whole concept of the promised land. That sounds a lot like ownership, like being given a specific territory. How does that fit with being just tenants?
Ah, that's where the nuance and, frankly, the really fascinating part comes in. Yes, there's this idea of a promised land, described with words like eretz, earth or land, natural inheritance, Yerusha, possession.
So sounds like ownership.
On the surface. But here's the crucial bit, the part that really challenges modern assumptions. That promise was not unconditional.
Okay. There were strings attached.
Big strings.
Yeah.
The Israelites' ability to possess the land, and more importantly, to stay there, to enjoy it, depended entirely on them following specific rules, the covenant stipulations. It was a gift, absolutely, but a conditional one.
Not a blank check then. What were these conditions? What do they have to do?
They were pretty comprehensive. Religiously, they had to worship Yahweh exclusively, no other gods. That was central to their identity. They had to live a holy life-specific moral conduct, rituals, laws. And socially, critically, they had to practice righteousness and justice.
What did that involve?
Caring for the vulnerable, the poor, widows, orphans, even strangers, sharing the land fairly among families, preventing wealth concentration.
And what about the land itself? Was there a direct environmental ethic?
There was. They were told to care for the land. Think about the Sabbath year letting the land rest every 7th year, or the Jubilee year every 50 years when land went back to original families. It was active care, not just passive occupation.
Wow. So a deep sense of responsibility baked into the deal.
Absolutely.
And if they failed, what were the consequences? Just, divine disapproval.
Oh no, the consequences were stated very clearly and were very real. Failure meant losing the land.
Really? Like physically losing it?
Yes. The text points to the Canaanites being dispossessed for their failures. And later, historically, Israel's own exile is attributed to their failure to uphold the covenant, idolatry, social injustice, neglecting the land.
The land vomited out its inhabitants is the phrase sometimes used, right?
Exactly. It's powerful imagery.
Yeah.
The land itself had conditions. And it wasn't an end in itself either. It was the means to achieve well-being, prosperity, honor, and for Israel to be a sort of moral example to other nations.
A means to a higher purpose, not just property. And it sounds like this connection was tied to their very identity.
Profoundly. The land gave them a root of existence, a place of honor and dignity. Being forcibly removed was seen as a violation of identity itself.
That resonates even today, thinking about displaced peoples.
It does. And the implication, according to some interpretations of these texts, is a call for peaceful coexistence, for sharing resources, because the earth, if managed ethically, is sufficient for everyone. A stark contrast to scarcity thinking.
Okay, so that Old Testament view land as a conditional gift, tied to responsibility, is one major ancient perspective. But even outside of that, justifying private property has always been tricky, hasn't it? Our sources say it's surprisingly difficult. Why?
It is surprisingly difficult when you really probe it. We take it so for granted now. It's baked into our laws, our economy. But the fundamental question is, if the earth was originally for everyone, how does one person get exclusive rights to a piece of it, especially when others might lack basics?
Yeah, that's the tension.
It's driven centuries of debate. Roman law tried to tackle this early on, providing a foundation for Western ideas. They talked about occupatio, a natural possession, basically first come, first served. Finding something that belongs to no one, stuff from the land, the sea, the air, even captured in war. You take it, it's yours. Nature provides, you take its gifts.
So finders keepers, essentially. But that's different from buying a house, right?
Right, that's the other mode they had, traditio. That's about the transfer of ownership through delivery, with intent. Giving, selling, bequeathing. That involves human agreements, societal structures.
Okay, but was Roman ownership absolute? Like, could you do anything with your property?
This is a really key point and often missed. Even dominium, the concept of ultimate power or mastery over a thing, was probably never seen as truly absolute in Roman law.
Really? Even back then?
Yeah. There was an implicit understanding that individual ownership had limits. The Justinian Code, for instance, explicitly put the interest of the Commonwealth above individual property rights sometimes. Public good could override private claims.
That's fascinating. The idea of absolute property rights might be more modern than we think. What about the Greek philosophers, Aristotle?
Aristotle, always the pragmatist, saw benefits to private property. He thought it brought pleasure. People like owning things. He argued it leads to better care. You look after your own stuff better.
Makes sense.
And importantly, he thought it enabled virtues like generosity. You have to own something before you can share it.
But he wasn't entirely sold, was he? There was a downside.
Definitely. He was ambivalent. For Aristotle, the art of acquisition, just piling up wealth, was not the path to a good life. He warned against pleonexia, this insatiable desire for more, which he saw as dangerous and divisive.
So property was useful, but needed limits.
Yes. He believed private property should ultimately be at the service of common use. It had a social function.
Okay. And Seneca, the Stoic, took that critique of greed even further.
He did. Seneca really lamented how avarice, greed, tore the community asunder and became the cause of poverty. He directly linked individual wealth accumulation to social breakdown and inequality.
He looked back to a sort of golden age.
Kind of. He contrasted it with a primeval state of fellowship before greed fractured everything. It's a powerful moral critique.
Moving into the medieval period, Christian thinkers like Augustine wrestled with this too, adding theological layers. Divine ownership versus human laws.
Augustine's view is incredibly rich, full of this tension. He acknowledged the Psalms. The earth and its fullness belong to the Lord. That's divine right.
Right.
But he also saw that human laws, made by kings and rulers, establishing property systems, were necessary for a peaceful society to avoid constant fighting over resources.
So human invention, but maybe divinely permitted for order.
Sort of. He said it was not thereby averse to divine disposition. It served a practical purpose in the earthly realm.
And this is where his famous distinction between caritas and cupiditas comes in. That seems crucial for understanding property in his view. Can you explain that, maybe with an analogy?
It really is central. Augustine draws this line. Caritas is selfless love. Loving something for its own sake. It's unpossessable, a longing for something you can't really own. Think of appreciating a beautiful sunset.
Okay. You love it, but you don't need to own the sun or the sky.
Exactly. You appreciate its beauty, its grandeur, but the idea of owning it doesn't fit. Its ultimate object might be God, something inherently unpossessable.
In cupiditas.
That's the opposite. It's self-centered, possessive desire. Wanting something for my gratification, to make it mine. It's not just admiring the sunset. It's wanting to buy the land it sits over, control the view, maybe charge admission.
Okay, I see. So property, by its nature, tends to express cupiditas. making things mine.
That's the tendency, in his view. It's about appropriation for self-gratification.
So does Augustine condemn private property then? Is it inherently bad?
Not quite. This is where his nuance is important. He doesn't just say it's evil. He talks about a hierarchy of measured or proportioned loves, meaning the righteousness of the owner matters. How you use your property can redeem it, in a way. If you use your wealth charitably, support your family responsibly, contribute to the common good.
Then the property itself takes on some goodness from the user.
Right. The virtue isn't in the owning, but in the virtuous use of what's owned. It's a way to bridge that gap between God's ownership and the practical need for property laws.
That's a sophisticated way to handle it. Then Aquinas comes along, builds on this, but also faces new challenges, like the Franciscans, who had very radical ideas about poverty.
Aquinas, always a synthesizer, tried to find a balance. He suggested different standards. For monks, the contemplative life demanded stricter poverty, maybe no private property imitating Christ.
But for regular people,
For the laity living in the world, he thought a more tolerant attitude towards property was necessary and lawful. Echoing Aristotle, he said procuring and managing things is competent to man and needed for a peaceful society.
but still not quite natural law.
No. He called it a human device. Not part of natural law, but not opposed to it either, just rationally and practically preferable for keeping order.
And he's famous for that dire need exception. That seems like a huge challenge to absolute property rights.
It is. It's incredibly relevant even today. Aquinas said that in situations of dire need like starvation, it's lawful to take another's property, openly or secretly, to save your life or a neighbor's life.
Wow. So human law doesn't trump the basic right to survive.
That's the implication. It's a limited and temporary suspension of property law based on the higher moral obligation to preserve life. He also talked about superabundance.
Meaning having way more than you need.
Exactly. He said what one owns in superabundance is owed to the poor for their sustenance. A strong moral obligation, even if the specifics of how much and when were left to individual judgment.
That's quite radical. And the Franciscans took it even further with this use without right idea. That caused a big stir.
Yeah, a massive controversy. The Franciscans, especially figures like Bonaventure, aimed for simplex usus facti, simple use of fact.
Use without right, what did that mean?
It means they didn't want to legally own anything. They just wanted to use what was necessary for life. Food, clothes, shelter, as a matter of fact, outside the whole legal system of ownership.
So living completely outside property law.
That was the ideal. They saw this simple use as existing outside its jurisdiction. They drew a sharp line between that and ius utendi, which is a legal right to use something. They wanted a life pure and simple, beyond the law.
Creating a sort of communal life based on use, not ownership.
Exactly. A koinos bios, a common life imitating Christ and the apostles.
And this led to clashes, with the Pope even.
Big time. Pope John XXVI pushed back hard, arguing property was God's gift to Adam, linked to dominium or mastery. He saw the Franciscan view as undermining the Church's own position.
And Occam defended the Franciscans.
William of Ockham did. He argued that true dominium needs a legal system, a coercive judge, which didn't exist initially. He defended the Franciscan use without right as this unique way of life beyond legal constraints.
It's incredible how deep these debates went, wrestling with the very foundations of property, power, and society.
Absolutely. It shows our modern struggles over property rights and environmental ethics have incredibly deep historical roots. We've been debating this stuff for a very, very long time.
Okay, so we've journeyed through ancient covenants, medieval philosophy, and theological debates. Now let's bring it forward. The Enlightenment marks a huge shift, ushering in modern interpretations and often really competing visions of how we should use land.
It really was a revolutionary shift in thinking. Before the Enlightenment, you often had this view of the world as, charged with the grandeur of God, as the poet Hopkins put it. Nature had a kind of inherent meaning or purpose.
Right, a sacred quality maybe.
Perhaps. But thinkers like Descartes and Newton brought in a more mechanistic view. Nature as a complex machine governed by physical laws we could figure out, less a living entity, more an intricate clockwork.
And that changed how people saw their place in it.
Fundamentally, this mechanistic view, combined with the explosion of technology during the Industrial Revolution, it fueled a move from dominion, which often implied stewardship.
Outright domination.
Exactly. The sources talk about industrial plundering. Nature was increasingly seen as just a collection of resources stripped of that divine status, and new tech, steam power, mining, fossil fuels allowed us to exploit those resources on an unprecedented scale.
And the idea of human progress got tied up with controlling nature.
Very much so. A kind of secular humanism emerged, where human liberation came from dominating the natural world. Accountability towards nature, which was strong in earlier traditions, got swept aside to a large extent.
So attitudes became more utilitarian. What can nature do for us?
Largely, yes. Defined on utilitarian and exploiter grounds. How much can we extract? How efficiently? The focus shifted heavily towards economic gain rather than inherent value or moral obligation.
That is a stark contrast to the conditional gift idea we talked about earlier. But the sources also say modern environmentalism isn't just secular, nor is it purely religious. It suggests we need collaboration now. Why?
This is crucial for today's world. The ecological crises we face, climate change, biodiversity loss, they don't respect ideological boundaries.
Right.
Environmentalism draws from both religious traditions, ideas of stewardship, creation care, and secular thought, scientific understanding, ethical reasoning. Neither perspective alone has all the answers.
So we need both working together.
That's the argument. Collaboration between religious groups and secular humanists, atheists, everyone is vital because all these traditions have concepts that can improve our human-earth relations. We need that broad coalition.
Okay, so if divine command isn't the main justification for property in the modern secular view, what is? How do modern ethics ground property rights?
Well, one hugely influential idea, going back to Locke, but really developed, is the labor theory of value.
Right, we touched on Locke earlier. Mixing your labor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea is you own yourself, you own your body, therefore you own your labor. When you take something from the common state of nature, land, wood, whatever, and you apply your labor to it,
You make it yours.
you create value, and that transformed thing becomes yours. You cut down the tree, make a chair. The chair is yours because your labor created it from the common material.
But Locke had that crucial catch, right? The proviso.
He did, the famous Lockean proviso.
Yeah.
You can acquire property this way only if enough and as good is left in common for others.
And that's where the debate really kicks off.
Big time. What does enough and as good actually mean? Thinkers like Robert Nozick interpret it minimally. Basically, you can take stuff as long as you don't make others worse off than they were before. Maybe your innovation even makes things better overall, justifying the privatization.
But others read it differently.
Yeah. People like Alan Gibbard argue Locke intended a much stronger requirement, really ensuring a plenty is left for everyone. It has huge implications for everything from historical land grabs to intellectual property today.
And besides labor, there's the efficiency argument.
Right, just a pragmatic argument. Private ownership works better. It incentivizes people to care for their property, invest in it, manage resources well because they benefit directly. Common resources, the argument goes, can suffer from the tragedy of the commons, where everyone exploits it and no one takes care of it.
Okay, so you have these justifications, but then they run headlong into environmental protection, leading to conflicts like the wise use movement.
Exactly. The wise use movement is a really clear example of this modern property rights battle. It actually has roots in an older tension.
Between who?
Between Gifford Pinchot, the early head of the U.S. Forest Service, who advocated wise use, meaning scientific management, for long-term public benefit.
Conservation for use.
Right. And John Muir, the naturalist, who pushed for preservation, setting wilderness aside, protecting it from use.
And that evolved into something more political later on, this Sagebrush Rebellion.
It did. In the mid-70s, you saw this coalition, ranchers, miners, loggers, off-roaders, mostly out west, pushing back against federal land control. They wanted states or private owners to take over public lands.
And they adopted the wise use label, but twisted it.
That's what the sources argue. They manipulated Pinchot's phrase. For them, wise use essentially meant nature should only be preserved if it's for direct human economic use and extraction. Preservation for its own sake was out.
And this had real political clout.
Oh, yeah. It influenced the Reagan and Bush administrations, leading to rollbacks of environmental rules, opening up more areas to drilling, mining, logging, weakening things like the Endangered Species Act.
And the rhetoric was intense. Ron Arnold calling environmentalism a wolf skulking in the garden.
Very potent rhetoric. He portrayed environmentalists as the sneaky, destructive force out to annihilate the livelihoods of rural people who depended on resources.
And they framed regulations as
As land grabs, occupations, takeovers, really strong Hobbesian language. Environmental policy was painted as this menacing government stealing what people rightly owned.
So in their view, it wasn't really about the environment.
That was Arnold's explicit argument. He said it's about control of resources, about economics, about power, not the environment. He called it the environmental movement's ambition to be resource allocator for the world.
A power play disguised as ecology.
That was the framing. And the core motivation, the harm argument, was simple. These regulations cost you something, this harms you. Lost jobs, hurt businesses, restricted land use. It pitted economic freedom and property rights directly against environmental protection.
A powerful narrative rooted in specific ideas about rights and economics that still shapes debates today. But now let's pivot to a completely different vision: indigenous land stewardship. This seems like it's drawing on ancient wisdom for modern solutions.
It really is. And what's striking, what's a real aha moment in the research, is how Western science is now confirming how effective indigenous stewardship is.
So it's not just a nice idea, there's data.
Absolutely. Robust scientific evidence shows indigenous peoples globally are effectively managing huge areas of intact forests, freshwater systems, biodiversity hotspots. It challenges that whole notion that modern Western ways are automatically better land management.
Give us some examples. What does the data show?
It's pretty compelling. In the Amazon, indigenous lands hold about a third of the basin's above-ground carbon, crucial carbon sinks.
Wow.
And between 2003 and 2016, those lands had only a 0.1% net carbon loss. That's the lowest loss of any land category in the Amazon. Way better than conventional protected areas.
That's incredible. And biodiversity.
Similar story. Analyses show indigenous lands in the Amazon shelter up to nearly half, 49% of all vertebrate species in South America. They are critical biodiversity refuges.
So, quantifiable proof of effectiveness. What's the foundation for this? Is it just land rights or something deeper?
Land rights are crucial, a fundamental building block. Getting legal recognition for their territories is key, though it's often a struggle. Only about 28% of the Amazon basin is legally recognized indigenous land, far less than their traditional areas.
But it's more than just legal title.
Oh, definitely. It's rooted in a fundamentally different worldview. The sources stress this. Indigenous peoples often see themselves as part of their land, not separate owners dominating it. They aim for harmony with the natural world.
A stark difference, the sources call it.
It is. Their identity, spirituality, survival are all tied up with the health of their territory. It's not just a resource base. It's kin, it's home, it's sacred.
And how do they organize this stewardship? We read about life plans. What are those?
Plans de Vida, or life plans, are amazing. They're community-driven environmental and territorial management plans, developed from the bottom up.
Involving everyone.
Yes, elders with traditional knowledge, leaders, women's ages, young people. They might map hunting grounds, sacred sites, plan sustainable harvests, manage water. Women often have crucial roles in agriculture, soil knowledge, maintaining crop diversity.
So it blends traditional knowledge with planning.
Exactly. They're living documents, adapting constantly. It's a holistic approach, ecological, social, cultural, spiritual, all integrated.
Are they also using modern tools to help protect these traditional ways?
They absolutely are. They're incredibly adaptive, using Western tech and institutions strategically.
Like how?
You have indigenous lawyers using national and international courts to defend land rights. They're using satellite imagery to spot illegal logging or mining incursions, using drones for monitoring, GPS mapping to document traditional land use.
It's combining ancient wisdom with modern tech for defense.
Precisely. It gives them powerful evidence to fight land invasions and hold governments and corporations accountable.
And that quote from Valeria Pay Pereira feels really significant here about the Amazon.
It's incredibly powerful. Indigenous peoples have maintained the Amazon for millenniums and can keep doing so if we let them. It's an assertion of their historical role and a demand for the autonomy to continue it.
And history backs this up. The Amazon wasn't just untouched wilderness.
No. Archaeological evidence shows large, complex societies actively shaped those forests for thousands of years, contributing to the biodiversity we see today. It's a managed landscape, a product of sophisticated indigenous practices.
So their struggle isn't just about conservation for themselves.
It's much bigger. It's about building a global, enduring, sustainable future for all humanity. They're demonstrating a path forward based on respect and reciprocity that, frankly, the rest of the world urgently needs to learn from.
So after journeying through all these different perspectives, what does it all mean for us right now?
Well, we've seen this incredible arc, haven't we? from ancient ideas of land as a conditional, sacred gift, demanding responsibility.
Right, where God was the ultimate owner and humans were tenants with duties.
Then through classical and medieval thinkers wrestling with how you even justify private property.
Yeah.
The Romans with occupatio, Aristotle's pragmatism, Augustine's curitas versus cupiditas.
Aquinas trying to balance necessity and charity, and the Franciscans with that radical use without right.
Exactly. Then that huge shift with the Enlightenment nature as a machine, dominion becoming domination, utilitarianism taking hold, often pushing accountability aside.
Which contrasts so sharply with the indigenous stewardship models we just discussed, which science is now showing are incredibly effective.
And we saw that modern tension played out in things like the wise use movement, framing environmental protection as fundamentally a conflict over property rights, economics, and power, highlighting the real-world harm regulations can cause.
It really is a clash of worldviews.
But the common thread through all of it is how our underlying assumptions about our relationship with land, whether it's owned, gifted, earned through labor, or something we're part of, shape everything.
How we define property and stewardship directly impacts the planet's health and our own future.
Absolutely. These questions, ownership, use, responsibility, justice, they aren't new. But facing global challenges like climate change, biodiversity collapse, resource competition, they feel more urgent than ever.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to chew on, something to take away from this deep dive.
Okay.
Consider this. If many of the oldest and arguably most sustainable traditions view land fundamentally as a gift and our use of it as conditional, what does that imply about our real moral obligations to the earth and, just as importantly, to each other?
Especially now when these huge shared global problems seem to demand collective stewardship, maybe something more than just exclusive ownership.
Exactly. What stands out to you about how all these different perspectives, the ancient covenants, the philosophical debates, the modern conflicts, the indigenous wisdom might come together, or maybe need to come together, to shape a future that's truly sustainable for everyone? Something to think about.